during that period of that 7 months, if you were an Israelite, you might have felt like, has God abandoned us because the ark is no longer in our possession? Well, now the ark of God is back in Israel, and that's where we're going to start off this morning. Now, at the end of last week, we talked about the great mistake made by those who grabbed hold of the ark, not grabbed hold, looked inside of the ark and was struck down because they did something that Scripture was clear that they should not do, and that was look inside the ark. So that town decided to send the ark away. So they sent it, verse 1 of chapter 7 of 1 Samuel. So the men of Kiriath Jearim came for the ark of the Lord and took it to Abinadab's house on the hill. They consecrated his son Eleazar to take care of it. Now I put Abinadab's house, I put his name in blue because that name is kind of unusual, but it's not really unusual. You know, think of an English name for a guy that is not terribly unusual, but not terribly common. Can you give me an example of heck, Sandy, you got a name that Sanford is not overly a common name. So this is a name much like that. It's just kind of a little bit uncommon. And I was looking at that name and I was looking at that, I've seen that in Scripture before. Where have I seen that name before? Even though I've read this passage, I mean, it was like, it was weird because I'm like, it took me on a little side trip. And you know how I talked to you previously the last couple of weeks where I said the book, the Bible, is really a family book. And this morning is going to be an extension of that family revelation because that name is one of the names of David's older brothers, just in case you were curious. So, well, Sanford's easier to pronounce. So I have a question that I'm going to throw out. It's a rhetorical question unless somebody feels passionate about answering it. And if the bottom corner slide of here, it says, why not take the ark back to Shiloh? Now, again, it's rhetorical unless somebody feels passionate about trying to answer that question. Anybody feel passionate about answering that question? That's where it was before it got captured. Okay, so you're thinking prophetically, all right? That's an option to think. Well, they touched it enough to take it to Kiriath Jearim. Well, the milk cows got chopped up and obviously, yes, that is true. All right. So by the end of the slides that we go all the way through, we'll hopefully you'll walk out of here knowing why the ark isn't taken back to Shiloh. Okay? Just throwing that out there because this is a family book. This map should show you where we are, and we'll go over here and we'll talk about the journey again for those of you that weren't with us. We started up here at Shiloh. They took it over here, lost it at the battle. The Philistines captured it, took it to the 5 cities, sent it back over here. This is where the calamity occurred, where they peeked inside the ark. And now they've taken it here. And this is its current resting place. All right. I just wanted to show that to everybody. Fred likes maps. Anybody else like maps? It kind of gives you perspective. And then one of the interesting things is it's always good to know distance because it's like 29 miles from Shiloh to Jerusalem. So here's Jerusalem, there's Shiloh. This gives you a feel that this area is very much like Wing to Wilton. It gives you that feel. It's that small town feeling. It's no different than that. And this journey that we see here could all occur inside western North Dakota, inside of this area. Matter of fact, Israel is a pretty small nation. Now, in Sunday school, we mentioned that every now and again you see a passage of time that just jumps out at you. Here's one of them. Verse 2. Time went by until 20 years had passed since the ark had been taken to Kiriath-Jearim. The whole house of Israel began to seek the Lord. Now, this is interesting because in reference, this is 21 years later than when the ark had gone missing. Samuel told them, if you are returning to the Lord with all your heart, get rid of those foreign gods and the Asheroths that are among you. Dedicate yourselves to the Lord and worship only him. Then he will rescue you from the hand of the Philistines. So the Israelites removed the Baals and the Asheroths and only worshiped the Lord. Samuel said, gather all of Israel at Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord on your behalf. Now, Mizpah is sort of halfway between Shiloh and Jerusalem. Just if you remember that map just a moment ago, we'll back up just once real quick. There it is, kind of halfway between Jerusalem and Shiloh. Give you a reference point. Everyone got that reference point? All right. When they gathered at Mizpah, they drew water and poured it out in the Lord's presence. They fasted that day, and they confessed, we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the Israelites at Mizpah. When the Philistines heard that the Israelites had gathered at Mizpah, the rulers marched up toward Israel. When Israel heard about it, they were afraid because of the Philistines. Then the Israelites said to Samuel, don't stop crying out to the Lord our God for us, so that he will save us from the hand of the Philistines. So the Philistines are going to try to catch them unexpected, march their armies up against them while they're in the presence of worshiping the Lord at Mizpah. That's a pretty good plan if you are the enemy, right? Catch them when they're not expecting to be attacked. Strategically, that does occur. Actually, that's the formula in which the Israelis took Golan Heights and the Gaza Strip and Jerusalem back, because they were experiencing their religious occurrence when the Muslims attacked them, and Israel was able to expand their territories as a result. But here we see that importance where the men at Mizpah said, don't stop crying out. It is important enough that we need God's hand of favor in this. Stay vigilant in prayer. Vigilant in prayer. Then Samuel took the young lamb and offered it as the whole burnt offering to the Lord. He cried out to the Lord on behalf of Israel, and the Lord answered him. Samuel was offering the burnt offering to the Philistines, drew near to fight against Israel. The Lord thundered loudly against the Philistines that day and threw them into such confusion that they fled before Israel. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing. Can you imagine how many of you ever had like a shock that was created by the sound of thunder? Because it can be vigorous, right? Anybody ever have lightning hit the house or close to the house that you feel it? Your hair can stand up. This is such a type of scenario where the thunder was so loud it shocked the army that was coming against them. And it threw them into confusion. And while they were confused, Israelites took the advantage. The men of Israel charged out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines, striking them down all the way to the place of Beth-kar. Afterwards, Samuel took a stone and set it upright between Mizpah and Shen. He named it Ebenezer, explaining, "The Lord has helped us to this point." That's kind of a cool name, Ebenezer. The Lord has helped us to this point. And here we are, repentant hearts. The Ark of the Covenant is kind of like not in its home, but it's back in our possession. We know that God's presence is with us. We have begun purifying ourselves, repenting of the wickedness that we have had in our lives, and we have seen God's hand move again. These people have probably not seen a lot of God's hand move since Eli died. They haven't. And that was 20 years ago. So the Philistines were subdued, and they did not invade Israel's territory again. The Lord's hand was against the Philistines all of Samuel's life. The cities of Ekron to Gath, which had taken from Israel, were restored. Israel even rescued their surrounding territories from the Philistines' control. There was also peace between Israel and the Amorites. Now, I pause there for a moment because there's something that is interesting that's going on here. And that thing that is interesting is this next passage. Samuel judged Israel throughout his lifetime. Every year he would go on circuit to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and he would judge Israel at all these locations. Notice, then he would return to Ramah because his home was there. He judged Israel there, and he built an altar to the Lord there. Now, remember I told you this is a family book. Now, what was the question on our first slide? What was the question on the first slide? Okay. Why not take the ark back to Shiloh? Samuel's not at Shiloh. Samuel's at Ramah. Now, Elias, how old are you? 12. You're not quite a teenager yet. Okay. But you're 12. All right. Remember the story where Eli told Samuel when he thought Eli was calling him, he kept on saying, tell him, and he would come running to Eli, and Eli's like, I didn't call you. And he's like, well, after several occurrences, Samuel says, well, somebody's calling me. And Eli says, well, tell Lord that you are listening the next time you hear it. And so he called. He was probably a teenager. You're almost to that point. All right, how long ago was that? From this passage? Probably not quite that much. At least 21 years. 21 years later, Samuel's now the judge, and he's not living where he was raised. But he's living in Ramah. Let's scratch our heads. He's living in Ramah. No, that's not where the cows went. Back in chapter 1, the first part of Samuel, we see this woman who is barren, without child, without ability to conceive. Her name is Hannah. She goes to the place where the ark is stored to pray regularly. Her husband takes her and his other wife there, and she is praying vigorously before God there and weeping and crying, and Eli thinks she's drunk. He thinks poorly of this wicked woman who's crying as she is praying. But she is, as we take up the verse 10, deeply hurt. Hannah prayed to the Lord and wept with many tears, making a vow. She pleaded, Lord of hosts, if you will take notice of your servant's affliction, remember not to forget me and give your servant a son. I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life. His hair will never be cut. I am praying from the depth of my anguish and resentment, as she is explaining to Eli, who thinks that she's a drunk woman. And Eli figures out she's not drunk. He says, go in peace. May the God of Israel grant your petition that you have requested of him. Shortly thereafter, verse 19, the husband, the next morning, Elkanah and Hannah got up early to bow in worship before the returning to the Lord, before the Lord. After they returned home to where? Ramah. I told you this is a family book. So after Eli died, Samuel does what? He goes home. We think, how many of you are seeing this for the first time? I mean, if you've ever read the Bible through a year, you've probably read this, but it might not have connected. That after Eli died, he goes back home. He becomes a judge of the Israel nation from Ramah. And he's in the community where mom is and dad is. And he has his own family there and has his own children there. And he goes on circuit. He's a circuit preacher. He's a circuit preacher. And he's still under his vow as a Nazarene, absolutely. I remember years ago, just because we're talking about circuit preachers, there was one particular Sunday, I was the interim pastor at the Church of the Nazarene in Sydney, Montana. And the Alexander pastor asked me if I would fill in. And so I had to look at the schedule of the service, because I could go to Alexander, preach, and then go to Sydney there and preach, and I could get both morning services done. And then I was asked to fill the pulpit in Williston that evening. So I preached at 3 services that day. I had a white Oldsmobile. Oldsmobile Achieva. Close enough. The Alexander Church was very similar to this church in many ways. So it was a very small town feel to it, just like this church is. Very much so. Sydney was a little more bigger community, a little more populous of a congregation. But this, so anyway, sidetrack. I'm sorry, I digress. But we think the commitment that Hannah gave to Eli and to give the child back to the Lord was a commitment that kept her disconnected from her son for her life. And it is not. The sacrifice was but for a short few years of his life. And Samuel was rewarded because he kept the Nazirite vow, and he got to spend the time with family. After God made the adjustments to the nation of Israel and the adjustments to Shiloh, he was no longer needed in Shiloh. He was able to uproot. And hey, the Ark of the Covenant wasn't there. And the Ark of the Covenant wasn't Samuel's responsibility as it was his predecessor's responsibility. And so here we are, 20 plus years later. Samuel's in his 30s, most likely. Maybe late 30s, maybe early 30s, we're not sure. But he's back with mom, so to speak, as a figure in her life. Now, if you have grandchildren and you have access to them, that's like a cool thing. You know, to have, and Samuel moves back at his opportune time. So it's kind of cool. Again, this is a family book. passage of time, when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges over Israel. His firstborn son was named Joel, and his second was Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. However, his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned towards dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. I'm 51, soon to be 52. And I think back to the life-changing experiences of my youth. I can remember them pretty well. Maybe not quite as well as I did 10 years ago, but I can remember them pretty well. And I look at this and I say, Samuel, you saw what the Lord did to Eli. You need to do something about this. You need to do something about this. And here we are at this place where time seems to be repeating itself. It's an interesting dilemma. Now, how many of you have ever had to learn a hard lesson more than once? Now, if you're like me, learning it a second time is more painful than the first time. Because you're like, I should know better. I really should know better. And here we are. Time for change. As this is occurring, a season of change has to occur. So the elders of Israel gathered together and went to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, look, you are old. Again, verse 1 tells us some time has passed. And your sons do not follow your example. Therefore, appoint a king to judge us, the same as all the other nations have. So here the people are coming to the judge of the last spiritual judge of authority. Okay? Now, let's just talk for a moment, because most people don't realize we have two judges of authority not mentioned in the book of Judges. Are you catching that? We have two major judges of authority not mentioned in the book of Judges. We think the book of Judges is the conclusion of the period of the Judges. Eli and Samuel are in the period of the Judges. Samuel appoints the first king, and then we come in the period of the kings. So here we are. A time of change is coming. In our own life, there are times that we have to make a decision in our own life to not repeat what we know better of. Again, going back to the analogy, how many of you had to learn a lesson twice? If we've got the information to know what is right, we need to operate on what is right. And sometimes, just like with Eli, Samuel is discovering it may be hard to correct family that are in the wrong. But it is necessary. It is necessary for us to be positive influencers in their life. Otherwise, that failure of our responsibility will be part of our judgment. And so a season of change is coming. Let us be obedient to be the vessel of change. Let us be obedient to do what we know is to be right and worthy. All right, let us stand and close in prayer. Do we have a closing hymn?